Barbara Richardson, Ron Lanius, Roy Miller, and Binny Deverell, known to their partners and rivals in tandem as the Wonderland Gang, were occasional sneak thieves and semi-successful drug dealers in the late 1970s, early 1980s Los Angeles County. Their miniature cocaine and heroin empire was cut short by an unexplainable, unsolved murder on the 1st of July 1981, leaving all who knew them across Laurel Canyon and Los Angeles at large, grasping for answers in a sea of evidence that drowned us all in doubt. As a hope to provide more substantial reasoning built upon observable evidence and situational analysis, this is an examination of the 4 on-the-floor murders and the harrowing mystery on Wonderland Avenue. This is Cold Case Detective. The first victim of the Laurel Canyon murders and leader of the infamous Wonderland Gang was Ronald Lee Lanius, born in Sacramento, California in 1944. One of the last members of the silent generation in the western United States, Ron ventured off to the war in Vietnam in the late 1960s. Serving in the United States Air Force, his military career went south when he involved himself in the drug trafficking trade in Vietnam. He was eventually caught smuggling heroin back into America via stashing paraphernalia on the bodies of deceased US soldiers. This led to his dishonorable discharge, to which he responded by moving back to Sacramento and getting mixed up between 27 separate homicide investigations throughout the early 1970s. Ron almost wound up in jail himself in 1971 when he was convicted of murdering a police informant a year prior. Of course, through a sick sense of irony, the prosecution's key witness was murdered in an unconnected police shootout, and Ron avoided a life sentence, somewhat unluckily. Over the next few years, Ron found himself in and out of prison for smaller crimes, such as smuggling more drugs across the US-Mexican border. Without a doubt though, he was planted into the consciousness of the law enforcement at large. Some police claim he was the coldest, most calculated person they ever met. Others wondered if a trash can would replace his coffin after death. Regardless of how authorities felt about him, they, nor any of his associates, could deny Ron's unparalleled calm demeanour. Fellow Wonderland Gang member David Lind once said his pulse never went above 70 beats per minute, even with a gun at his temple. And despite all of the infamy, darkness, and legendary misconduct, Ron still married before his murder, marrying Susan Murphy, the only surviving gang member at the scene of the Laurel Canyon murders, on April 16, 1971. The second victim was Valentine's Day baby William Raymond Billy Deverell, born on February 14, 1937, the right-hand man to Ron and second in command of the Wonderland Gang. Billy was raised in a modest world until the seduction of the drug world drew him into an inescapable addiction of the easy money from drug dealing. During working hours, Bill disguised himself as an overhead crane operator, but by night was a skilled criminal and burgeoning presence on the street. His illicit actions took a toll on Billy's psychology, as he suffered from intense periods of depression, guilt, and self-loathing. In fact, these mental hurdles often pushed Billy to the limit, almost forcing his hand to quiet the life of crime and using drugs altogether. Yet, when he went under the watchful wing of Ron Lanius and was made first mate of Wonderland, he folded at the fork in the road, tucked to his old ways, and eventually found himself on the wrong path towards destruction. The third victim was the leaseholder of the townhouse that ended up being the murder mansion at 8763 Wonderland Avenue, as well as the girlfriend of Billy Deverell, Joy Audrey Gold Miller. Joy came from a luxurious previous life, the ex-wife to a lawyer in Beverly Hills and mother of 2 children, yet turned to heroin after the walls of gold crumbled and she found herself consumed by the drug culture of 1970s California. It was through these efforts that Joy met the Wonderland Gang and joined their collective, getting arrested 7 times throughout the preceding years, Despite contracting breast cancer, physical health declining or not, Joy invested in her drug use and the gang at large, literally signing the lease away on her and her partner's lives. The fourth and final victim was not an official member of the Wonderland gang, but rather a close associate. Born on the 17th of October in 1959, Barbara Richardson was quite young when killed on the 1st of July 1981, yet still led a reckless life up until that shocking moment. She was dating the aforementioned David Lind at the time, who was also an Aryan Brotherhood motorbiker. The couple took to heavy drug use soon after meeting, and through a complex set of circumstances, wound up as police informants. After their criminalistic lifestyles took a turn, they moved to Los Angeles to join the Wonderland gang as legitimate members, but never made it past initiation when lightning struck Laurel Canyon that summer of '81. In the later years of the 1970s, 5 unlikely criminals band together in Laurel Canyon, Los Angeles, California. Ron, Billy, David, Tracy, and Joy. They see the unparalleled riches stemming from the cocaine trade market and decide to cut their own slice of the pie. Together, they set up base camp at 8763 Wonderland Avenue, known as the Wonderland Gang thereafter. Before the calendar flipped to 1980, however, the Wonderland Gang garner their first and most infamous customer in John Holmes, a former porn star known for his body more than his character. By the time he found the gang, he was thousands of dollars poorer, after spending his paper on drugs from the crazed crime lord himself, Eddie Nash. Over the next couple of years, leading into the early 1980s, the Wonderland Gang is frequented by close associates Susan Murphy and Barbara Richardson. Together they became the Shameful Seven, and make a reputation for themselves, unlike Los Angeles had ever seen. By the spring of 1981, the Wonderland Gang's operation is pulling in serious cash. Smooth sailing for the Shameful Seven with a lot of promise for the future. Their only headache was John Holmes, a leech at the 8763 Wonderland Avenue property. The gang doesn't mind him too much, using him as a petty errand hand, and finding amusement in the former celebrity's crumbling social status. But his fatal effects are yet to take full force. As the heat of summer in Los Angeles in 1981 ratchets up, the gang starts to realise their potential with Holmes and his connections to Eddie Nash. Holmes agrees they should act on his dissolving relationships, and they begin plotting a hit on Nash's treasure trove of a mansion in Studio City, California. Their target: cocaine, heroin, drug paraphernalia, boatloads of cash, and antique guns that once belonged to the gang. In the early morning hours of June 29, 1981, John Holmes ventures to Nash's mansion as if it was any normal day. He buys his usual order of crack cocaine, taking note to the location of the desirable, but forgets to leave the patio door unlocked. Holmes returns later in the evening and successfully secures the door open for the planned robbery. When he goes back to the Wonderland base camp, he finds the gang high on heroin and waits for their recovery, drawing a map of the mansion for their heist. As late morning arrives on the 29th, Holmes feels paranoid, and that too much time has passed, and goes back to Nash's mansion once more to solidify the unlocked patio door. Once Holmes returns, Ron, Billy, David, and Tracy journey to Studio City to make the hit. Tracy McCourt stays put in the stolen Ford Granada as lookout man, while the other 3 enter the unlocked doors, claiming to be the authorities. Nash's 300-pound bodyguard, Gregory Dials, is first to approach the Wonderland trio, but is quickly overtaken and handcuffed. In the scuffle to detain Dials, one of the men's handguns misfires and hits Dials in the back. The noise of the gunshot wakes Eddie Nash from another room, and he enters to find his muscle man handcuffed and his valuables under siege. It's not long before Nash realises the severity of the situation and begs for mercy. He drops to his knees, pleads to be spared, and opens the safe containing most of the goods. The crew acts fast, hauling away their treasure, and escape Studio City with what would later be valued at $1 million worth of drugs, weapons, and cash. In the afternoon of June 29, 1981, the Wonderland gang returns to 8763 to divide their haul amongst the members. However, they give lesser shares to Holmes and McCord, lowballing their efforts and infuriating the two men. Nevertheless, Holmes takes some of the stolen jewelry and goes about his day. Over the next 24 hours, Eddie Nash swears his revenge on those who humiliated him and his personal legacy. He sends his goons out into the city of Los Angeles looking for possible suspects. One of his right-hand men spots Holmes strolling through Hollywood, wearing a notable ring that belongs to Nash. The news spreads faster than fire, and Nash brings Holmes back to his estate for questioning. Confined and threatened, Holmes is forcefully interrogated until he spills the names of those responsible for the home invasion, reportedly witnessed by Scott Thorson, one of Liberace's former lovers. What happens between this interview and the murders is unknown, but at around 3 a.m. on July 1st, 1981, less than 2 days after the Nash Mansion robbery, a group of unidentified men enter the Wonderland gang property in Laurel Canyon. They prowl from room to room, targeting individual members one by one, wielding striated steel pipes meant for bludgeoning. Their first hit is Barbara Richardson, sleeping in the downstairs living room. The second hit is Roy, sleeping in the rear downstairs bedroom. With him is wife Susan, but the killers only severely injure her, as she would later survive despite horrific brain trauma and a lacerated finger. The third and fourth hits are Joy Miller and Billy Deverell in the upstairs bedroom, Joy on the bed and Billy in the corner. Between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. that fateful morning, neighbours hear plenty of commotion coming from 8763, but figure the gang is throwing another party and ignore the noise. Little do they know, some of the most gruesome murders in Los Angeles history is taking place right under their nose, on that otherwise innocent stretch of road on Wonderland Avenue, forever mystifying the rest of Laurel Canyon's concerned community and LA County in total. When dissecting the entire scene of the crime and the violent nature of the murders, it's quite a shock that no viable evidence was retrieved from 8763 Wonderland Avenue in the forensic analysis, except for a handprint belonging to John Holmes on the headboard of a bed. Because Holmes was a frequent guest of the gang, it couldn't directly link him to the murders. And with the era in which the crimes were committed, DNA evidence had not entered the prosecution sphere or scientific community in general. Thus, without physical or biological clues, investigators were scrambling for answers early on. One of their first orders of business was finding the surviving members of the gang, who were in their eyes the most likely to have killed the four victims. David Lind, who had befriended Ron in prison years prior, was apprehended and provided the vital piece of information law enforcement needed. Claiming to have been in a hotel room with a prostitute in the San Fernando Valley on the night of July the 1st, David Lind explained he wasn't anywhere close to Laurel Canyon, instead dealing drugs in a small, covert, unconnected deal. This led to a more official interrogation by authorities, where they were able to coax more confessions from him. Lind eventually revealed the dead Wonderlanders had carried out a massive theft at Eddie Nash's mansion 48 hours before their demise with the help of John Holmes. While it didn't inform anyone's involvement in the murders, the police finally had a direction to take their investigation. It linked John Holmes to a multitude of crimes, and anything involving the short-tempered, frantic Eddie Nash had to be considered as something sinister. Without a doubt, had Lind not been in the valley on July the 1st, and instead was just another victim of the Wonderland murders, his testimony wouldn't have given the proper lead to Nash, Holmes, the robbery, and ultimately one of the most obvious arrests and shocking acquittals in the history of true crime murder mysteries. Without question, the overwhelmingly popular theory determining who committed the Wonderland murders revolved around Eddie Nash, Gregory Giles, and their goons. It doesn't take much common sense to connect the dots between robbing an unstable crime boss and the likelihood of revenge. After all, Scott Thorson did write years later he witnessed Nash himself order a retaliation after Holmes coughed up the names of the Wonderland gang. Not only that, but Los Angeles detectives Tom Lange and Robert Souza found over $1 million worth of cocaine in Nash's possession a week after the killings, along with specific artifacts that were rumoured to have belonged to the Wonderland Avenue residents. Despite these discoveries, however, the LAPD first arrested John Holmes for the Laurel Canyon murders, charging him and him alone without any other suspects in March of 1982. This arrest sprouted from the discovery of a single handprint belonging to Holmes on the headboard from one of the Wonderland's bed frames. Surprisingly, the prosecution argued Holmes actually wasn't a lone wolf, that he was an accomplice in the murders, acting as a gatekeeper to the Wonderland building and let the hitmen enter without notice. After a much scrutinized trial, Holmes was acquitted on June 26, 1982, for each count of murder. Some pertain the acquittal to the success of Holmes's two court-appointed lawyers, who argued Holmes was a victim, threatened and scared into helping the true masterminds without much of a choice. The self-defense proposition swayed enough jurors to forego the circumstantial evidence, along with the fact that Holmes did not cooperate with police, law enforcement, or testify in court at all, for which he would later spend 110 days in jail for. Even Holmes's wife, Sharon Holmes, admitted she was suspicious of him as well. She had told reporters back in July of 1981 that Holmes had said he knew the men who were inside the Wonderland residence the night of the slayings, and was at the house just before they happened. She also stated years after John Holmes died that the morning after July the 1st, her husband had returned home with blood splattered on his clothes, yet he remained uninjured. This was never proved nor cross-referenced, and were the only details Sharon remarked upon, never assisting either the police or the prosecution. Unfortunately, John Holmes passed away in March of 1988 due to complications from AIDS, taking with him the truth he had regarding his involvement in both the Nash Mansion robbery and the subsequent murders. Holmes wasn't the only suspect to ever find himself in front of a judge and jury though. In 1990, 9 years after the Wonderland incident, police were still stepping on the tail of Eddie Nash. They charged him with the conspiracy and planning of the murders of Barbara Richardson, Ron Lanius, Roy Miller, and Billy Deverell, with his bodyguard Gregory Diles charged as a participant. The prosecution included Scott Thorson as a witness to testify against Nash and Diles, and seemed to have the two gangsters in a corner. But when it came to sentencing, the trial ended prematurely with a hung jury, votes coming in at 11-1 for conviction. Nevertheless, the California courts kept at them and tried Nash and Diles again in 1991. This time the two suspects were acquitted of all charges and set free. It would be the last attempt by authorities to pin Gregory Diles, as he died from liver failure in 1997. His personal accounts of the morning of July 1st, 1981, still unknown. In 1996, both local and federal authorities joined together and held a 4-year investigation into the totality of Eddie Nash's suspected crimes. At the turn of the millennia, the task force arrested and indicted Nash under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act for money laundering, drug trafficking, conspiring to murder the Wonderland gang, and even bribing the holdout on the first jury of the 1990 court case. During arraignment in September of 2001, Nash agreed to a plea deal, most likely due to his age and deteriorating health. Thus, Eddie Nash pleaded guilty to the juror bribing and the money laundering charges, but never admitted to the murder conspiracy. Rather, Nash stated he sent his associates, including Gregory Diles, to the Wonderland residence only to collect his stolen items, to which he concluded there was a possibility of violence without confirming anything. Nash paid up a $250,000 fine, spent 4 years in prison, and lived the rest of his life in silence regarding the events of that bloody summer in 1981. He died 2 decades later, on August 9th, 2014. Once Eddie Nash passed away, it removed the last known major player in both the LAPD and the general public's agreed-upon theory regarding who committed the Wonderland murders. But because all three were acquitted, no physical evidence was ever presented, and their testimonies went to the grave. The killings still technically unsolved, with no justice imminent. And while it's highly improbable, there's a chance Nash, Diles, or Holmes never actually killed the gang. Even if Holmes gave up the gang's cover as the previous heist thieves, and Nash sent Diles and the goons to reclaim his property, it doesn't automatically mean they committed murder, despite the overwhelming circumstantial events. In fact, there are large groups of interested minds who look at the missing members of the Wonderland gang who escaped misfortune and weren't at the residence on July the 1st. David Lind and Tracy McCourt were both serendipitously absent from Wonderland Avenue when their peers were bludgeoned to death, and some wonder if it may not have been so accidental. Lind was in fact the person who gave authorities their biggest lead in John Holmes, going as far as to admit the gang had robbed Eddie Nash days prior. Despite Lind's own personal involvement with the heist, he still snitched to the police, seemingly to save his own skin. However, it's worth considering if Lind himself tipped Eddie Nash to the Wonderland gang's involvement, coming away with both the riches from his share of the Nash Mansion hit and the gang's empire after their death. Or Lind killed the other members himself with the same outcome in mind, using the Nash heist as a scapegoat. It would give law enforcement a believable suspect to pin the murders on and leave Lind to escape untouched. Or maybe the police knew Lind was guilty but still went after Holmes and Nash in exchange for Lind's cooperation in other investigations. It was a known rumour in the years after the slayings that David Lind became a police informant in Southern California. Gossip so strong, his position in the criminal underworld became controversial with rival gang members, who dismissed his credibility in general. Because confidential informant records are not kept nor discussed publicly, Lind's greatest role in an applicable conspiracy is unknowable, as he passed away from an overdose in November of 1995. Tracy McCourt could have a similar motivation to offing the other Wonderland gang members. He was frequently teased, called Titmouse Tracy by David Lind even, and left out in bigger gang dealings. For the Eddie Nash invasion, McCourt was originally supposed to be part of the robbery, but after his handgun was taken away by Lind, he was given no other choice but to be the lookout driver. Some circles of amateur sleuths believe McCourt was then given less of a share due to his lesser role, and subsequently angered as a result of both the shortchanging and long-term disrespect. Thus, McCourt could have quickly organised a hit against the gang, staying home the night he knew the terrors would come down. Of course, if it were true, he would have failed overall, as his biggest transgressor, David Lind, ended up living through the entire ordeal. Yet maybe that could have pushed McCourt away from the Los Angeles life of crime in the end, as he moved to Colorado afterwards, and wound up in and out of prison for assault and trafficking charges. Much like Lind, we'll never know if McCourt indeed had a role in his friend's demise, as he passed away without known cause in October of 2006. Before we divulge our hypothesis, we want to make known our conclusions presented in Cold Case Detective are purely logical speculation, based on evidence, circumstantial and factual subtext. We are only privy to the same information presented in each video, and we do not attempt to promise certainty, or an expert guarantee on the findings we reach in closing. We simply observe, research and report. Whether you believe in the far-fetched conspiracies or the nearly clear-cut conclusions to Laurel Canyon murders, one thing is certain: whoever slaughtered the Wonderland gang did so with a vengeance and intent on causing more than harm, but also a suffering demise unlike most people had ever seen. Based on the gruesome crime scene and medical examination post-mortem, it's obvious there was an intent to unleash evil. This was no accidental manslaughter or carefree homicide. This was revenge served in the coldest of blood. We believe that while Eddie Nash and Gregory Diles were acquitted of direct involvement in the murders, they were certainly responsible when considering all the players connected to the Wonderland gang. They had the most clout, the most resources, and obviously a motive to inflict such brutal gore. However, we also conclude that neither men were likely to have been the actual parties who assaulted and killed each gang member. Rather, they were leaders in a band of unknown cronies who carried out their retaliation. Diles might have had a physical role in the shakedown, but considering he had been shot in the back less than 48 hours prior, he was probably just a motivator. John Holmes, on the other hand, was in all likelihood complicit in allowing access to the Wonderland resident, but had no clue to the extent to which Nash and his goons would slaughter the gang. Was he at the house the night of the murders? Nearly doubtless. Was he using one of the pipes? Probably not. And the biggest question of all of them, will we ever discover who actually was? To put it bluntly, no. Those secrets went to the grave of all three naysayers in Holmes, Dials and Nash. Their identities will remain silhouettes, the darkest spots on an incredibly dark moment in the history of Los Angeles crime. The identities that will be remembered are those of Barbara Richardson, Ron Lanius, Roy Miller, and Billy Deverell, four humans with despicable pasts, yet still undeserving of the cruel, inhumane ending they encountered on the night of July 1st, 1981, at 8763 Wonderland Avenue. The night blood poured thick in Laurel Canyon, California. This has been Cold Case Detective.